Hello, everyone, and welcome to the American Catholic Thought and Culture lecture series. My name is Arthur Versluis. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Religious Studies here at MSU. And I have been introducing these talks for more than a decade. And I'm really delighted to be able to present our speaker tonight. If you are interested in further events, you can find events listed on religiousstudies.msu.edu. And the reason I mention that is we're engaged in a search for a spirituality chair named for Father Jake Folio. And the speakers for that will be listed on that website as they come up. But for right now, as you may know, Father Jake Folio died this past week. And we'd like to hold just a moment of silence in his memory now before I introduce our speaker and we move forward. So thank you for taking this moment. So we're going to hear from Professor Paula Kane. Paula Kane holds the John and Lucine O'Brien Marist Chair of Contemporary Catholic Studies and is a professor of religious studies at the University of Pittsburgh and has a secondary appointment in the Department of History, as well as being a core faculty member in the program in cultural studies. Her PhD is from Yale University, and she's been a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of American Religion at Princeton University. And her fields include American Catholicism, American history, popular religion, religion in the arts. She's published on film and architecture. And her books include Sister Thorn and Catholic Mysticism in Modern America, Separatism and Subculture on Boston Catholicism, Gender Identities in American Catholicism, part of the American Catholic Identities series. And so I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you to MSU virtually, Dr. Paula Kane.
I guess that must be my cue.
That is your cue.
All right. Well, hello to all my new friends in Zoomlandia. Through the miracle of the internet, you can see I'm able to be here in East Lansing and in Pittsburgh at the same time. And it sounds like today has been very exciting in Michigan. So thanks for making time to join me tonight against the backdrop of foiled kidnapping plots. I am grateful to the local committee who oversees this event and the organizers at Michigan State, Professor Arthur Versluis and Professor Sonia Fritchie. And thanks especially to Penny Shanks for her management of details, publicity, and getting the Zoom thing to work. So I'm sorry I'm not able to meet you tonight on your very beautiful campus. Because of my own job history, I know that Michigan State, founded in 1855, is the pioneer for land-grant universities in the United States that were later created by the Morrill Act of 1862. And I knew that because I taught at one of them once upon a time, Texas A&M in College Station, Texas. Events like this evening's are needed more than ever. We are in a contentious moment in our public conversation and in this election season, and misinformation abounds. But we shouldn't forget that there is a reality out there and that we can learn about it through the use of our brains our study of the past, and our application of reason. My specific point is that American Catholics deserve a more robust intellectual culture. There should be many more occasions to discuss and debate the tradition, its legacy, and its meaningfulness in our own time. The simple acknowledgement that differences exist among Catholics prepares us to resist falling into traps about Catholic identity. So Catholicism is a big tent. It contains a wide range of peoples and opinions. No one person or idea, not even the Pope, singularly represents it. Similarly, one issue cannot define the entire Catholic tradition. It's been discouraging for me as an American historian to see the progressive history of the Catholic Church, as represented by its social teaching since 1890, documents and organizations that defend labor, the poor, the orphan, the refugee, the sick and dying, and now the planet itself, ignored in order to concentrate on only one thing. Furthermore, the great strength of Catholic tradition in the US is that it has been concerned with promoting the common good, a concept that is being negated daily by leaders whose thinking is purely transactional and self-serving. Pursuit of the common good has been a strong suit of Catholicism, and it deserves greater attention. So, my plea to Catholics: defend our robust intellectual and scientific inquiry, continue to support Catholic studies at public universities, such as this one. It's too important to be left to religious institutions. So, on your own, learn about the progressive history of Catholic social teaching, re-examine the documents of Vatican II, which do govern the Church to this day. Read the statements of Pope Francis, remarkable for their attacks on the culture of wealth, for their defense of migrants and the poor, and his pleas for stopping climate change. So thus ends my sermonette on the need to defend a broad and generous notion of Catholic identity and to cherish it in public higher education. So my topic tonight is a peculiar one. It is basically the uses in modern America of a particular mystical phenomenon known as stigmata. Now, teaching undergraduates online for the past months has shown me that it is hard to follow an online lecture. So let me briefly outline what I plan to do this evening. First, using about 40 slide images, I hope to acquaint you with the history of stigmatization inside Catholic traditions of mysticism. Secondly, to present some details of a case study of an American nun who claimed to be the first reported American stigmatic. And third, put these events in the context of an international Catholicism. Okay. So what is stigmatization? Among the odder elements of Catholic mysticism are stigmata, the belief that since the Middle Ages, a select group of persons chosen by God have been marked supernaturally with the wounds of the crucified Christ. About 400 of these persons have been recorded since the 1200s. More than 90% of them are women. Although the phenomenon starts in the 13th century, most of the claims occur in the early modern era and in the 19th century. So I'll profile an American stigmatic of the early 20th century. Sometimes research projects happen by accident, as did this one. You might recognize the Touchdown Jesus mosaic at the Hesburgh Library at Notre Dame. So I was visiting the archives of the University of Notre Dame, and the archivist wandered by and asked me to help him test out the new computerized finding guides. He said, "Enter a term that won't have too many results." On a whim, I typed in stigmata, which brought up only a few items, notably a letter by a priest describing his experience of getting special permission to visit a woman at a convent in Peekskill, New York in 1922. Here is that woman. Why is she in a wheelchair? Stay tuned. The priest's letter told of strange happenings. A three-dimensional red crucifix had appeared on the wall of Miss Margaret Riley's room at the convent, where she was visiting from Manhattan to make a spiritual retreat. She was not a nun then, but just an ordinary laywoman. Some folks had tried to remove the crucifix from the wall with cleaning solvent, but had failed. After just 3 days at the convent, Margaret found that her left side and feet were bleeding. Later, the remaining wounds of Christ and a crown of thorns around her forehead appeared. Margaret stayed at the Peekskill convent, it turned out, for the rest of her life, and became a sister in the Good Shepherd congregation. She took the religious name of Sister Mary of the Crown of Thorns. And when I met all the nuns in that congregation now, they always just referred to her as Thorn. So that's what she's become to me, Sister Thorn. The priest who visited Margaret, named Father Bertrand, learned further that the cross on the wall at the convent duplicated one on Margaret's chest that had been arriving 4 years earlier, seen only by her parents. Father Bertrand heard her tell of receiving the stigmata 7 times on her hands, feet, and side. After these episodes of bleeding, the skin returned to normal with no sign of scars. This was typical of stigmatic wounds. Over the next 3 years, Margaret also reported having visions of Jesus and of Mary, and of being attacked by invisible demons who tortured her. The demons took the forms of various creatures, along with the usual Beelzebubs and Lucifers. Her convent superior wrote all these things down in a notebook, luckily for me. Father Bertrand was one of the few persons to hear Margaret's life story in her own words, and he judged her to be about 27 years old. She was actually 37 at that point. He learned that Margaret was born in Manhattan to very pious parents from Ireland. By very pious, I mean that the family kept even stricter fasting rules than required, avoiding meat on most days. They had memberships in 2 parishes and dutifully sent their children to parochial school. They set up a home altar in 1 bedroom, and they hung a holy water font at the front door. Margaret's mother had wanted to become a nun in Ireland. This is one of the churches they attended, the very ornate Jesuit flagship church on Park Avenue, which has this beautiful mosaic dome, and it's so ornately decorated you think you're in a Baroque church in Europe. So that was one parish, and St. Francis de Sales was the other parish they attended. I'll show you just a map here of Margaret's Manhattan to orient us. So here's Manhattan with Central Park in the middle. And the family, you can see, lived on the Upper East Side, which was not an affluent place then. It was kind of beyond the pale of settlement. And her father was a building contractor and had enough money to buy a home in the 94th Street area, which was still being built up at that point. So they lived there. St. Francis de Sales, as you see, is just two blocks away, whereas the other parish they attended, St. Ignatius, was much further down, another 15 blocks away or so. So I point these things out simply because the geography of Manhattan was interesting because of Margaret's penitential efforts, which we'll hear about in a minute. So Margaret attended these 2 parishes and went to confession in yet another parish, Blessed Sacrament, that you see on the west side on West 71st Street, because there was a very famous confessor there who was also her confessor. He allowed her to wear a hair shirt. I kind of wonder where she got this, since it probably wasn't available at Bloomingdale's, Bergdorf, or Macy's in Manhattan. So he probably supplied it to her. Margaret was a good penitent, but a poor student, and her formal education stopped before high school. Later in life, as fellow nuns were writing her biography, they said that Jesus had distracted her in order to draw her onto better things, presumably her life of perpetual suffering. In this era of what we call devotional Catholicism, devotional practices were the things that kept the Riley family together. The parents went to communion daily, 2 of only 4 people in their parish to do so. The household said the daily rosary, led by Mr. Riley. They made a home altar in a bedroom, as well as hanging that holy water font. Margaret was inspired to mortify herself from a young age, putting ashes in her shoes and walking in the rain with no umbrella. Her spiritual directors piled on more penances, which she eagerly performed. She would avoid streetcars or the new subway to walk across Central Park from 91st Street on the Upper East Side and then walk 70 blocks south to go to confession at the West Side Parish. Given this penitential family context and following the strange things he had heard at Peekskill, what was Father Bertrand's impression of Margaret? That her suffering offered a moral lesson for the rest of us. The patience of this willing victim, he said, can only be understood by those whose privilege it has been to come near to her. Never has she been free from suffering, as she has never been restored to what might even be regarded as fair health. So despite Margaret's misery, all he saw was a living model of Christ's passion that he commended to all Christians. If you are wondering if Father Bertrand's report of Margaret's stigmata, which he mailed to numerous friends, caused a stir, you would be right. Even the nuns in Margaret Riley's convent begged people not to share it because it was full of mistakes, and they were alarmed at the bad publicity it caused them, especially in the newspapers. Here is the first article that appeared from the New York World in 1922. Girl with vivid cross on body puzzles both clergy and laity. Nuns worldwide, however, were supposed to cultivate modesty and never draw attention to themselves. As soon as the public learned about the stigmatic, however, visitors lined up daily outside the convent gates in Peekskill, hoping to catch a glimpse of Margaret or to meet with her. This led the Archbishop of New York to refuse permission for most visitors, to forbid the Good Shepherd sisters from talking about Margaret themselves, and to prohibit Margaret from contact with outsiders. As Father Bertrand's letter started me on my research journey, its presence at Notre Dame was my slender first clue. How did it end up there, and why? I learned that the priest who was then president of the university, John Kavanaugh, had also visited Margaret Riley in Peekskill after getting permission. He had received a copy of Father Bertrand's letter from Margaret's doctor, who turned out to be one of the most prominent American Catholics of the 1920s. Why would these important folks concern themselves with an uneducated, middle-aged woman who believed herself favored with stigmata? Didn't this sort of thing seem rather archaic in modern Manhattan, where Margaret grew up? And if it was true, what merit did it have for Catholics in the US? Using as many archival sources as I could locate, since Margaret Riley left no writings of her own, I built a thick description, as anthropologists say, of the impact of her supernatural claims. Stigmata were unknown in the US, nor was there any big track record of miracles, apparitions, or bilocations here, as there were in the Old World. In fact, such mystical phenomena would seem to be a liability for Catholics in a society where they were underdogs, and where Protestants, still waging the Reformation, dismiss such beliefs as superstitions. And furthermore, it's probably obvious to you, stigmata are not one of the fun mystical gifts like levitation or bilocation. So just imagine if we could attend both the Steelers and the Lions games at the same time, hovering above the stadiums. I tried to understand the meaning of claims of stigmatization, not by judging whether or not they really happened, but rather through the lived religion of those who experienced Sister Thorn as a genuine mystic and who tried to create enough interest in her to make her the first American saint. My account of her religious experience combines subjective and objective features, what people felt about Sister Thorn, and what we can know and say about the experiences she reported. The kind of piety and devotion that she represented is of a pre-Vatican II type, which could have pernicious effects, especially on women, through its intense preoccupation with suffering. Research then led me to church and convent archives, hospitals and medical schools, city, state, and national institutions on 2 continents. There are national and international connections. In North America, Sister Thorn's case involved the Catholics of New York, New Jersey, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, as well as Canada. I don't think there's any Michigan connection since the Good Shepherd Sisters didn't have a convent there. Because Roman Catholics in the US had been greatly limited in their economic mobility by Protestants until at least the 1960s, Catholics had been treated as second-class citizens, regarded as heretics, slaves of the Pope, and victims of superstitious beliefs and practices, from transubstantiation to holy water, from the cults of the saints to miraculous healings. In colonial America, except for a brief moment in Maryland, Catholics were unable to run for office, go to Mass, attend Protestant colleges, and so on. After the United States is formed and passed the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights, the First Amendment guaranteed religious freedom for all. But Protestants continued to regard Catholics as dangerous and anti-democratic subversives. And this battle was waged at least until the election of John F. Kennedy as the first Catholic president in 1960. Margaret's stigmata involved international persons and events as well, such as priests and sisters in Belgium, England, France, Ireland, and Germany. When World War I ended in 1919, 2 years before her reported stigmata, there was a revival of interest in mysticism as a source of consolation and union with God. And the strong theological emphasis among Catholics at that time upon the merits of suffering, as modeled on Christ's crucifixion. In the aftermath of the destruction generated by the war, the Catholic Church campaigned for the revival of Christendom as the key to consoling the survivors and rebuilding a broken Europe. Thus, the miraculous events that characterized Sister Thorn's life across the Atlantic can be seen as part of this effort to globalize Catholicism as the cure for a war-weary world. As one way to frame Sister Thorn's story, let me focus my remarks for the next minutes around 3 themes: stigmata, suffering, and sanctity. So beginning with the report of Margaret's stigmata, whether or not she really did receive them is one question I was not going to be able to answer with certainty, given the gaps in the data about her. What interested me more as a historian was the reason why such a report emerged in America in 1921, and the various interpretations of it by people who range from devout to skeptical. To study Margaret Riley, I needed access to her religious community's private archives, which was granted. The Good Shepherd archives, then in a house in Jamaica, Queens, New York, were an uncatalogued mess. Instead of a Sister Thorn collection, I was led to a room full of boxes, cartons, and trash bags. So the first part of writing the story was finding out if there was a story. The Religious of the Good Shepherd, or RGS, were a semi-cloistered congregation, meaning that because they dealt with school students as part of their mission to help delinquent girls and women, and took in hundreds of orphans and girls on their properties, their rules of seclusion were not as strict as those of fully cloistered nuns. The portion of the sisters who taught the children and cared for them had to be with them daily. So I here put up the painting that was on the poster that Penny made for tonight's event. This is a painting by Marjorie Phillips, the wife of the founder of the Duncan Phillips, the founder of the Phillips Gallery in Washington, D.C. And she painted it in 1922 and called it Nuns on the Roof. So I think it's kind of fascinating. This could well have been the Good Shepherd convent on East 90th Street, near where Gracie Mansion is today, the mayor's house. And you can see that the lengths that nuns went to preserve their seclusion in order to avoid contamination by the world. So they even take their outdoor exercise away from everybody else. So the Good Shepherd Convent in Manhattan was only a few blocks from Margaret's family home. One anomaly of her vocation, therefore, was how she ended up in Peekskill and never left Peekskill. Peekskill still today is rather bucolic, about 43 miles north of Manhattan. So I should explain that Margaret had gone there for a retreat. Her bleeding started after 3 days, and on day 34, she was supposed to be sent back to Manhattan to start her novitiate because she'd expressed the desire to become a member of the community. And on that day, she became paralyzed from the waist down and never walked again. So she never left Peekskill. To visit the Good Shepherd Convent in the 1920s, you needed permission from the Archbishop of New York or an invitation from the Mother Superior. Thus, the doctors and priests who came to observe Margaret could not just show up unannounced. Most petitioners were turned down as curiosity seekers. That's why most of the information about her came from priests or nuns who had reason to have extended stays at the convent. Margaret's alleged stigmata proved to be quite divisive in her own community, as shown by the results of a vote taken by the Mother Superior, which said that not everyone believed in their authenticity. However, the Mother Superior did believe in Margaret and remained loyal to her. So to summarize so far, we found that Margaret's surprising experience of supernatural bleeding led to dissension among her fellow sisters, a media frenzy outside the convent walls, heavy-handed response by the Archbishop, and a cadre of devout fans who were certain that a mystic was in their midst. Let's take a brief detour into art history next, because it helps us see how the phenomenon of stigmata has captured the imagination of centuries of Catholics because of the great stories. This will help us understand why many often contradictory stories were told about Margaret. Stigmatization refers to the mystical event recorded by certain Christians of receiving the 5 wounds of Christ as reported in the gospel accounts of his crucifixion. The only use of the word stigmata in the New Testament appears in a letter of St. Paul, in which he refers enigmatically to having received marks on his body. But he is not generally regarded as a stigmatic. Oops, I forgot to show this slide of the pretty standard fare convent in New York. So by the time Margaret arrived, it was basically a series of very nice red brick buildings. All right, so the very first recorded stigmatic was Francis of Assisi in the year 1224, 2 years before his death. His wounds appeared while he was meditating intensely upon his crucifix and saw a vision in the sky of Jesus as a 6-winged angel or seraph. These images show you that Francis is in folk art as well as in high art, and we usually associate him as the patron saint of the earth, care for the earth, of animals and birds and flowers and all living things. So the stigmata are not generally the first thing that comes to mind when we think of Francis. So Giotto was the first one to paint the legend about 70 years after Francis's death. This painting, which was done around 1300, is now in the Louvre in Paris, seized by Napoleon's troops in 1813 when they invaded Italy. So Giotto deviates from the Byzantine flat style of icon painting, and it signals the beginning of Renaissance perspective painting. So there's still a flat gold background that you can't see well in my image here, but he is trying to show some sort of expression on the saint's face. And there's an attempt to provide geographical locale with the church and various altars there and caves behind him, and some sense, primitive sense of perspective. So following Giotto, medieval artists began to show the connection between Francis and God as these red strings flowing from heaven down to the friar's hands, feet, and side. So these interpretations of the story were often quite literal and took their details from the accounts of Francis's life by a friar, Brother Leo. In the centuries before literacy was widespread, Catholics used the arts to spread knowledge of the life of Christ and the saints. The saints, as one sociologist has memorably said, are their stories. So the drama of a six-winged angel appearing in the sky after Francis has been fasting and meditating was compelling. But literalism was not the only way to tell the story. So my favorite image of Francis in the Stigmata is an early Renaissance painting that is quite unconventional. Bellini's St. Francis in the Desert, bought by Henry Clay Frick of Pittsburgh in 1915 for his museum in New York City, where it still is today. So you can see both the painting and people looking at the painting in that lovely, fantastic museum. It's a very subtle painting, right? There's no blood, there's no red strings, there's no floating crucifix. Instead, the saint, with his mouth open in awe, stands in a very strong posture that actually mirrors or parallels the towers that we can't quite see in the background. His faint wounds are just kind of a wash of red paint on the palms and one foot. There's a different close-up angle. So this portrayal in Bellini's telling of it is keeping with Francis's modesty as a Franciscan. So Bellini gives us Francis as the friar would have wished to be seen, and as he was described in the earliest accounts of his life by Saint Bonaventure and other later authors who shied away from gory versions of Francis's experience. We may have gone a little bit too far here, however, as we can see that Bellini has been reduced to a coffee mug in some iterations. A century later, the Greek who lived mostly in Spain, El Greco, gave us a Mannerist interpretation of Francis's experience. So only the skull on the rock reminds us of the inevitability of death, and it represents the turn towards a very interiorized piety that characterized the early 17th century. The skull is much larger than the tiny crucifix hovering in the sky. The point is that the experience Francis had of God is to make a change inside your heart, not to have you focus on Hollywoodish special effects around you. Although Francis was, for Catholics, the first stigmatic, by now you are probably thinking that he became the template for Sister Thorn. But you would be wrong. Since Francis, around 400 Christians have claimed this experience. More than 90% of them have been women, but only a very few women became saints. Two that you may have heard of are Catherine of Siena and Gemma Galgani, Italian women who lived 7 centuries apart. Their stigmata were not part of their canonization dossiers, however, for the prudent reason that the Catholic Church maintains that stigmata are no indication of holiness. So to reiterate that important point, the Catholic Church does not oblige anyone to believe in stigmata and does not regard them as proof of saintliness. Among the very few male stigmatics, the 2 best-known saints are also Italians, Francis of Assisi, and most recently, Padre Pio, a Capuchin friar who was canonized in 2002. You can see here his hands are covered up to avoid sensationalizing them. Crowds used to flock to Pio's monastery in the poorest part of southern Italy to hear him say Mass. And even in death, the saint's corpse attracts large crowds, including Popes John Paul II and Pope Francis. So this is a little bit macabre, I think, that he's been exhumed and put on display in a clear casket so you can see him. Pio's stigmata, however, remain controversial. Many claim that he made them himself with needles, carbolic acid, and iodine. Here's a more recent image of Pope Francis visiting St. Pio at San Giovanni Rotondo, where now there's a large hospital for care of the poor in southern Italy. Benedict XVI, by the way, was very cool towards the cult of Pio, and he bypassed the town and the corpse visits altogether. Art, like the frescoes of Giotto and the paintings of Bellini and El Greco, have fired the spiritual imagination, both shaping it and reflecting it. It helps us to see the stories behind the people and the events. So in earlier centuries, men like Francis and women like Catherine of Siena reported stigmatization as just one part of their mystical lives. By the 20th century, the meanings of stigmata needed to be fit to a different time and place. So with Sister Thorn, Catholics were trying to engage the new fields of psychology and the work of medical experts. So let's consider next two physicians who were involved in Sister Thorn's case and took opposite views. I had imagined that Catholic doctors would defend her experiences and affirm her as a genuine mystic, but this was not the case. So here are Doctors McParlan and Dr. James J. Walsh. Dr. McParlan, Margaret's neighbor and a friend, did regard her as a saint, and he defended her until his death, which preceded hers by a good 11 years. He was the first one who brought her to Peekskill for a spiritual retreat because he happened to know the Mother Superior. He was also the Archbishop's personal doctor and had received several papal honors for his medical service in New York. McParlan was a thoroughly admirable individual, but an extremely zealous defender of Catholic notions of the cult of suffering. His view of Sister Thorn was that he was powerless to do anything to help her, since the Lord had told him not to interfere. He regarded Margaret as a spiritual victim of God's love, and that God was purifying her through this intense suffering. Frozen into inertia by his faith, he was unable to ease her pain because he believed that God wanted her to suffer more and more. The term victim soul had been coined in the 19th century to describe a Catholic who assumed as much pain as possible in order to help remove or alleviate the suffering of others. And this was precisely what Dr. McParlan believed about Margaret. Dr. Walsh, on the right, was the polar opposite in terms of education and outlook. After getting his medical degree at the University of Pennsylvania, Walsh trained in Europe in the same clinics where Sigmund Freud studied. And after visiting Margaret several times at Peekskill, he diagnosed a classic case of hysteria. After offering this diagnosis, however, he did nothing to investigate its possible sources or to offer any remedies. A thoroughgoing rationalist, Dr. Walsh suggested if Margaret was put in isolation, her theatrics would come to an end. He was undoubtedly aware of the new publications by Freud and his partner on hysteria, but he sidestepped them on behalf of 19th century models of hysteria that were already outdated by the 1920s. 19th century neurologists had promoted the idea that women by nature were more prone to emotion and fantasy. Catholics were in the 1920s still suspicious of Freud because of his conviction that unconscious motives and sexual drives were an important part of human behavior. So the Catholic Church will dance around Freudianism for the next 50 years. Dr. Walsh had been dean of the medical school at Fordham University, and he was a widely published scholar on the history of medicine. He wrote over 40 books and 500 articles on Catholic medicine, history, and science. He also wrote popular titles like The World's Debt to the Irish and The World's Debt to Catholicism. His best-known book, seen on many a Catholic coffee table, was 13th Greatest of Centuries, which illustrated his favorite theme, namely that everything good had been discovered and created by Catholics in the Middle Ages. Neither doctor was interested in using biological theories about blood disorders or mineral deficiencies to explain stigmata. Walsh, who was generally skeptical about miracles, promoted instead the idea of mind cure that was fashionable at the time, the notion that mental power can affect the body. He urged the Archbishop of New York to consider that once Margaret was removed from her followers, she would stop having these episodes of stigmata. Dr. Walsh also undermined Dr. McParlan by telling the Archbishop that while McParlan was a pious man, from a medical standpoint, quote, his testimony is worthless. So my second point after stigmata is suffering. If her stigmata did not get medical agreement, her suffering did have a spiritual consensus. Many Catholics interpreted her agonies through the lens of victim spirituality, while her status as an invalid in the convent contributed to the atmosphere of pathos surrounding her. Margaret's adult life was full of suffering. Her stigmatic wounds caused intermittent pain. Her legs were paralyzed since the early days of her convent visit. She endured chronic illness and ultimately died from kidney cancer. So she was constantly being nursed by her religious community. Her devotees regarded her physical torment as beneficial. It helped them make spiritual connections to Christ and to other stigmatics. Here we see two famous stigmatisés of the 19th century. On the left, Catherine Emmerich was a victim of Napoleon's armies who shut down her convent in Westphalia. She's sort of the starting point of the stigmatic as invalid, bedridden, and she dictated all of her visions to a poet who sat at her bedside for years. Her visionary writings, by the way, were Mel Gibson's source of the screenplay for The Passion of the Christ, and the source, alas, of many anti-Semitic tropes. Next to Emmerich is Louise LATEAU of Belgium, who was investigated by the Belgian government in the 1870s as one of the most aggressive campaigns to prove that her stigmata were false, although they failed to do so. Her wounds bled regularly every Friday for many years, despite experiments that encased her arm in a glass tube to observe the onset of bleeding. Gemma Galgani, who died young at 33 and was canonized on the same day as the foundress of the Good Shepherd Sisters, was also a rather pathetic figure who had wanted to become a nun but was never accepted into a congregation. So she committed herself to being a celibate, dressing always in black, and suffering. Sister Thorne was referred to as a second Gemma Galgani because she also endured attacks from invisible demons. And you can see in the lower left here, there's a juxtaposition of young Padre Pio with Gemma Galgani. So two great Italian stigmatics. So the attacks that Sister Thorne and Gemma suffered from demons who took the form of black cats and so forth, it turns out that the monk who wrote Sister Thorne's life literally plagiarized passages from Gemma's hagiography and put all these into the Sister Thorne story. At some level, Sister Thorne's followers were looking for reassurances that she was the real thing because her experiences matched events in the lives of other stigmatics. So while for us, Francis of Assisi and Catherine of Siena were foundational figures, Sister Thorne's fans seem to rely more on these 19th century templates. If psychology wasn't welcomed, therefore, in Sister Thorne's circle, how did the medical profession involve itself? Given the pressure to produce empirical proof of stigmata, the medical investigations of Margaret in New York were surprisingly haphazard. After Dr. McParlan's untimely death in 1928, Dr. Walsh was the one who continued to see Margaret in Peekskill and to persuade the Archbishop with his advice, in tandem with the opinions of a Jesuit in London, a man named Herbert Thurston, who spent most of his days at the British Museum researching mystical phenomena. Walsh had corresponded with Thurston about Margaret Riley. providing enough evidence that Thurston was intrigued and published an article about her in Great Britain using a pseudonym for Margaret. His judgment on Sister Thorne was that she lacked the humility that one would find in a true saint, and surprise, that she was probably experiencing hysterical neurosis. Like Dr. Walsh, however, Father Thurston ignored Sigmund Freud. The birth of Freudianism around 1900 challenged accepting religious phenomenon at face value by seeking instead to look at the unconscious forces at work. For Freud, things that were difficult for the conscious brain to accept were converted in the body into a symptom that was expressed through the body. So trauma will find its way out, he said, in some sort of physical symptom. It could be strange food revulsions, phobias, paralysis. And it turns out that Margaret manifests all of these. Freud theorized that through the process of talking to the analyst, the patient would reveal in language the hidden sources of those visible symptoms and allow her to understand them. Freud was no feminist, but he made an important breakthrough from the 19th century neurology of his teacher, Charcot, to create a model for the role of the unconscious mind in expressing certain fantasies, including religious ones. Sister Thorne, in fact, had what Freud would consider a textbook example of paralysis caused by mental trauma. On the very day she was supposed to be sent from Peekskill back to the Good Shepherd Convent in Manhattan to serve her novitiate, she stopped walking and entered life in a wheelchair. So rather than face the threat of returning to Manhattan, and I can only speculate as to what she feared, for the next 16 years that she lived at the convent, she relied upon the aid of others to move her around. Instead of connecting Sister Thorne's refusal to leave Peekskill with her paralysis, her suffering was spiritualized, and she was named a victim soul, an individual who gave up her pain on behalf of others. Another major factor in interpreting Sister Thorne's stigmata as suffering is the international context, the horrors of the Great War, which had just ended, and which promoted a revival of interest in mysticism. Many Americans mourned the destruction of ancient churches, which they were seeing for the first time, and they were quite moved by the memoirs of chaplains who had accompanied the troops to Europe. Let me show you a few more images of these bombed out churches. These were made into postcards and sent back to the United States. Soldiers brought them home with them. They appeared in some of the newspapers more as line drawings because the techniques for, at that point, reproducing photos were not as good as we are now. But we can see here the saying of Mass inside even these destroyed churches, the praying of the soldiers, the presence of the priest among them. In the right photograph especially, he's kneeling in his cassock with his head uncovered. And I love this one as well. Here are the British helping the French remove statues from a church that's been bombed out in Armentières. And another scene of utter destruction inside these fantastic ancient churches. So one of the memoirs of chaplains that was very well known at the time of Margaret's life was that of Father Duffy, who had accompanied the famous Irish Fighting 69th of New York to France. So if you've been to Manhattan and tried to buy cheaper tickets for Broadway, you know this place, Father Duffy Square near Times Square and the tickets outlet. And we can see the image of his memoir on the right there. Serving on the Western Front in Europe, American soldiers were amazed at the many churches, chapels, roadside crucifixes, saint shrines, and so forth that were integral to European Christianity, but barely apparent in Protestant America. A Catholic mystic popping up in America at this time suggested that the vitality, moral energy, and religious power of the Catholic Church was now transferred to the New World. This was a good thing for American Catholics, whose nation had been considered mission territory by the Vatican as recently as 1907. So my third theme is sanctity. So far I've talked about stigmata and the endurance of suffering, personal and transnational from the Great War. two key words that are helpful to Sister Thorne, and sanctity is the third term. Sister Thorne needed followers to believe in her extraordinary qualities to promote her and help her cult develop. Among her friends, Margaret was renowned not only for her presumed revelations and stigmata, but for healings that were attributed to her. And she found an ingenious way to make contact with the outside world. Sometime after coming to the convent, Margaret began to have visions of Jesus and Mary, who told her that they had blessed holy cards of the Sacred Heart of Jesus for her. The cards are not remarkable. Margaret could get them anywhere from Catholic supply stores, but she took them and enclosed them in isinglass envelopes and embroidered the edges. She crocheted and sent out thousands of them before the Archbishop demanded that the Good Shepherds recall them all. But by then, miracles of healing began to be reported from various parts of the country by people who'd taken the badges and put them on the injured or diseased part of their loved ones. From Long Island, Cornelius Donegan wrote that his daughter's eye was cured after an operation. Dr. McParlan put a badge on a hospital patient who had gangrene in the appendix and intestines and found the patient cured in 10 days. Yet another deaf patient was cured by placing Margaret's badge over her ear for 9 days. The badges were treasured not only because Jesus and Mary had held and blessed them as they were being made, but the sick and suffering were seeing real results. So through these Sacred Heart cards, Sister Thorne had found a way to connect her cloistered life with the outside world and to put herself at the center of a healing cult. So she wasn't just a stigmatic or a visionary, she was also a healer. However, other evidence of extraordinary holiness that may have made her a saint may have been lacking in Margaret's case. Her so-called revelations from Jesus were quite mundane. He told her things like, nuns should not leave the convent without their shoes on. Her personal prayers were totally formulaic, and her fasting and suffering, while harsh, were not heroic. She did not, like the saintly women before her, reform her religious community or found a school or a hospital or even a special devotion. So in the end, Margaret did not become the first American saint. She was beat out by Mother Frances Cabrini, an Italian immigrant who recorded no mystical experiences whatsoever, but who spent a lifetime helping immigrants. The record of American saints is sparse. Although the Catholic Church has more than 10,000 saints, less than 15 are from the United States. On that list are Kateri Tekakwitha, a Mohawk convert in the 1600s before there was a United States, and Mary Ann Cope, a German missionary who joined a religious order in Syracuse, New York, but spent most of her life working at a leper colony in Hawaii. John Neumann, a German priest who was 4th Bishop of Philadelphia, was canonized in 1977. Catherine Drexel, founder of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, became a saint in the year 2000. While it would have been wonderful if Sister Thorne had been found to be a saint, times were changing. After her death in 1937, notions of sainthood were shifting in the U.S. It seems that Americans began to seek for good Catholic citizens to represent them, and not figures who reflected old world pieties. Margaret's own religious order, the Good Shepherds, decided not to pursue her canonization around the time of Vatican II, preferring instead to concentrate on its work on behalf of delinquent girls and women. Still today, the Good Shepherds continue to do admirable work. They've turned their efforts to trying to end sex trafficking of girls and women, and they serve as NGOs at the United Nations on these issues. To the broader question of saint-making in the United States, it is odd that no Irish-American nun or sister has been canonized, given that the vast majority of women religious in America for more than a century were of Irish ancestry. So, what dimensions of Catholic studies have we explored today? We began tonight by invoking the long history of Christian mystical phenomena, with roots in the 13th century. But then we bit off a small corner of that tradition, namely stigmatics, and then chewed on an even smaller piece, namely American stigmatics. Together, believers and skeptics on several continents showed how Sister Thorne crystallized the fears and desires of many Catholics of her generation and represented the great hope of many that the age of miracles was not past, but rather living right in their midst. Stigmatization turns an individual into a living crucifix, and while the Catholic Church doesn't oblige anyone to believe in stigmata, the interest in them was highly visible in popular devotions, especially between 1880 and 1950. These sentiments were heightened by the horrors of World War I, when so many families lost loved ones to war, but also to malnutrition and disease. Our journey tonight outlined the unusual case of an Irish-American woman from Manhattan who claimed to receive the stigmata in 1921. As Sister Crown of Thorns, she spent the remainder of her short life serving, as she believed, a spiritual victim for the suffering of others. After her death in 1937, her followers hoped to make her the first American saint, while her detractors dismissed her as a fraud. What is important about her for the study of American Catholicism? I think that unusual figures like Sister Thorne remind us that there is no true Catholicism hovering out there in our minds, but only Catholicism as it is lived by people in a particular time and place. The kind of spirituality which produced Sister Thorne and that she embodied was a punishing kind of faith in which suffering was rewarded, ultimately. Embracing an endless suffering during life, modeled on the Passion of Christ, was recommended to women and to women religious by countless school teachers, confessors, convent manuals, retreat masters, and sometimes even their doctors. That Sister Thorne did not become recognized as a saint is no tragedy, but it is a very human story about aspiring to be chosen to suffer more profoundly than the rest of us, and her contact with the places within Catholic tradition dedicated to honoring and uplifting that suffering. The Catholic Church has a well-developed culture of pain and suffering, modeled, of course, on the crucifixion of the Savior. On the positive side, the tradition offers spiritual support for those who suffer, with the promise of an end to it in the reward of eternal life. On the negative side, the glorification of suffering could lead to certain unhealthy psychological and gender dynamics that affected women particularly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that excellent talk. And I'd like to take this opportunity to mention that on the bottom right of your screen, you can pose questions. There's members of the audience can write, and the speaker will be able to see that. I would also like to take, while you have the opportunity to do that, I'd like to take a moment to thank St. John's Student Center and the local diocese for funding the endowment, and also the College of Arts and Letters, which holds the endowment, and for this series of talks. And so our thanks to both of those. We have a question to you and some thanks for the talk. So I will step back, and if you want to pose questions, this is the time to do it.
Okay, I have a couple already. So someone asked, I think before we even started, about the whole stigmatization, where it appears on the human body. And the questioner asked, wasn't it true that people were most likely crucified or received a stigmata in, shouldn't they be stigmatized in their wrists rather than their palms of their hands? This is true. Romans crucified people through their wrists because the bones would hold up the body weight on a cross, whereas put it through your palms, it would not hold the body weight and you would just fall off. So it's true that stigmatization is already an interpretation of a tradition, right? It's not realistically duplicating wounds of the crucifixion of someone like Jesus or other Romans who were martyred in that way. So yeah, absolutely, stigmata. It was already a twist on an original practice, a gruesome practice, but yeah. Liam, it's nice to hear from you. How are you out there? You asked what was the impact of the flu pandemic on Catholic culture in the early 20s. Wow, that was intense, actually. One of the many popular practices that grew out of that pandemic was for the sick to be given a piece of paper with sacred words of healing written on them, which they would ingest and chew as though it was something like the Eucharist. So I found that interesting. And I would say that in convents, there was a particular concern about the flu because people lived together in such close quarters and did everything together all day long and so forth. So there was some primitive health concerns to protect religious congregations from the flu, but many did in fact contract it and die. I don't know enough of the sources to say if Catholics responded to the flu by blaming the soldiers returning home. We call it the Spanish flu, but in fact, it seems it really began in Kansas at I think at Fort Leavenworth at one of the military training centers, and the soldiers spread it to others. They didn't bring it back from Europe. So like our concern for COVID-19 and its origins, it wasn't clear where the Spanish flu came from, but it was a huge concern that led to a lot of outbursts of a lot of devotional practices that were about trying to end it. Thanks for your question. Okay, another question. How do we address the stereotype of Catholic belief or tradition through the lens of Catholic mysticism, given that the latter is often seen as the dominant narrative, particularly in media? Ooh, that's a good question. I would say that it's a little disappointing to me that media tend to gravitate towards the sort of gory stories or the fabulous stories rather than thinking about the broader sweeps of traditions. And one of the impacts of Vatican II, I think, was to downplay a lot of this devotional behavior and of this mystical belief as taking away from the communal aspect of the central practice of Catholics, which should be the Mass and the Eucharist. So I would say that Vatican II was building upon a tradition that was already emerging as early as the 1930s. And I was surprised when I researched Sister Thorne that several of the people we would call pioneers in liturgical reform in the United States had spent their young years in monastic life and theological studies obsessing over this victim spirituality. And they came out of it as different people. And they said, we should not emphasize so much people's personal prayers and these one-to-one intimate relationships with the saints. We should focus on the whole community of the people as they celebrate together. So people like Romano Guardini and Carl Adams' theologies, which helped support the things that happened at Vatican II, the documents of Vatican II, their work against this older devotional style of piety, I fear, often gets swallowed up now again in a kind of return to a more conservative outlook on Catholic practice and faith. Did that help answer your question? A follow-up. Do you think that the Catholic administration is partially to blame for this, given that many, if not most of the patron saints were canonized due to their stigmatas? I would say that I'm not quite sure what the Catholic administration means. Do you mean the bishops of the United States, the NCCB or USCCB, or the entire Vatican apparatus, where there is a bureau for the canonization of saints? So I'm not sure if you mean the American context or the global context, but I will point out that, fortunately, none of these saints were canonized because of their stigmatas. And often, if you look through the dossiers that were presented in the actual causa or cause at the Vatican, you will see that the stigmata are often downplayed a lot or not really mentioned. So for Padre Pio, they were not admitted as evidence of anything. And for Gemma Galgani, the same thing. Nobody said, oh, she's a saint because she had the stigmata. So stigmata seem to be throughout a sign of some kind of divine favor, but not proof of sanctity or worthiness for canonization. But a good question and a common misconception about all these saints. You're a patient audience. All right, another question. A really tough one. Sister Thorne seems to be quite a passive figure here. And I have to say, yes. As I researched her and thought about her in writing the book about her, she seems frozen in that passive position in a lot of ways. But this is an interesting thing in and of itself. As a woman, she had certain limitations at that time in American culture. As an Irish American woman who had sort of a short-lived career as a stenographer, I think she found the draw of spiritual things more important for her. But she had gone through a couple of traumas in her life, which I think explain why she didn't want to go back to Manhattan. And it was hard for me to suss those out because of the secrecy of the sisters in their archives and the destruction of certain materials. But it appears that Margaret had a failed romance. She fell in love with her doctor. She was obliged to see a doctor, it turns out, before she entered the Good Shepherd congregation, who initially turned her down because she had very bad stomach problems. And it was not worthwhile for congregations to take on someone who was ill, because that would just be a burden on them for all of their ministry and works. So she had to see a stomach doctor about that, and she fell in love with him apparently, and then he married his nurse, which I think was a huge blow to her romantic disaster. I think that she turned to a life of being this sort of passive victim of things for a variety of reasons. So yeah, I think she was fairly stuck in that role, but she was so rewarded emotionally by people who supported this type of victim soul spirituality, that the more Margaret suffered, the better she was and the closer to Christ she was, and a better model she was for the rest of us here on earth. Okay, another question. Let's see. Do you think that those American Catholics canonized were chosen because of their more democratic, good Catholic citizen reputations, as opposed to those who were more like old world style mystics? As we get closer to our own time, that may be the case. The outlier seems to be Junipero Serra, the missionary in California, right? Serra's canonization was very controversial because Native Americans said he was no saint to us. He forced us to live on these brutal missions and forced us to work essentially like chain gang labor for centuries. So why should we make him a saint? So Serra is kind of a problematic case, but I think certainly with Cabrini, and my colleague Kathy Cummings at Notre Dame has written a new book on Cabrini and American saints that would probably give you more information than I can do briefly.
I think that's all for the questions from what I can see, and it's been an excellent presentation. It's really developed and fascinating. I've really enjoyed it, and I've seen in the questions, among the questions were also a number of people saying thank you, and I would like to echo them.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm glad you've got a lively community there to talk about stuff with. That's really good. especially these days. There's so much controversy, but again, the emphasis on Catholic intellectual tradition and heritage is important to develop, that people don't forget it.
Well, thank you so much, and we really appreciate your presentation, and we hope to see you again one of these days. And in the meantime, stay safe, everyone.
Indeed, and thank you. I do hope to meet you in person someday.
Likewise. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.